Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the natal chart of Bob Dylan. I went to see A Complete Unknown probably a couple of weeks ago, almost a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoyed the movie. It's like 2 hours and 20 minutes, and for my ADD brain, movies that long, I always get a little bit nervous that I'm going to be antsy, that I can't, sustain interest. But boy, I sure did. I can't say that it's 100% accurate. I think there were some liberties taken here and there, but it really is full of his music, and I think that you will thoroughly enjoy it, especially if you already admired his work. And so I was kind of surprised that I hadn't done his chart before. I thought I had, so anyway, maybe I did and I didn't post it. Who knows? But I wanted to talk about it, and it's so funny because I've tried to do this reading like I think about three other times, two or three times, and each time it was like I went on and on for like 20 minutes or more, and it's like why did I have such a hard time even trying to do this reading? And I think it's because Bob is such an enigma to begin with. He's not one of those people who you see in the tabloids all the time, or you hear about on social media doing this and that. He's pretty much a workhorse, um, as far as I have seen in terms of touring 200 days a year, whatever. I think he does that pretty much every year, if I'm not mistaken. And the guy is in his 80s, so that's very impressive. So the things that I want to hone in on, particularly looking at the chart of a celebrity, but in this case Bob Dylan is, does this chart show artistic talent? Does this chart show a rebellious nature? Because he is a contrarian. You could call him, a troll in some ways, but I would say like a Zen master, because the whole Zen thing is to blow somebody's mind, or kind of give them that expansive consciousness, expanding their consciousness through doing the unexpected, doing the opposite of what uh, a person thinks that you're going to do. Um, yeah, and there was something else I wanted to think about. I would say, because I was looking at his seventh house, I really think like his relationship situation, because he's had some high profile relationships in his lifetime, and what's that all about? But just like in general, too, his star power, if you will. So I'm going to go through some of his inner points as well as his ascendant. Bob is a Gemini, 3 degrees of Gemini, May 24th, 1941. So he was born during World War II. And the reason that this is significant is that he might be before the boomers. I don't know what generation. That's not the greatest generation, is it? Because, no, that was the ones that went into World War II. But the reason I say this is because I think the boomers began post World War II, like maybe about 45 and 46, that time frame. But anyway, so he's on the older side, the Beatles, especially John Lennon and Ringo were born in 1940, and Paul McCartney was born in 1942. So um, Bob Dylan is in between that. His moon is in Taurus. The moon is exalted in Taurus. His Mercury is in Gemini, and his Venus is in Gemini. His Mars is in Pisces, and he has Sagittarius rising. Those last four placements that I mentioned are all mutable. What does that mean? Well, mutable signs are changeable. We already know that. Oh, yeah, well, I said the last four, but his son too. We already know that he is a chameleon, a master of disguise in a lot of ways. He has had different periods where he has changed his look. I mean, you could say more when he was younger because people who are younger tend to be more into their image, invested in an image. As people get older, they just like let it all go to hell sometimes. But Gemini's just in general, when we think of Gemini's, Gemini in astrology rules the third house, which is the house of the mind and the house of communication, also teaching and learning. Now, it's the house of social media now because we have that as our primary source of information. Uh, Traditional journalism is also third house. But social media is kind of usurping traditional journalism like print and TV journalism because it's, more immediate and it's more bottom up instead of top down. So it's more democratic in that sense. But anyway, that's kind of a tangent. But the point is that people who are Geminis are known for their communication. Now, if a person is a sun in Gemini and they have Mercury in Taurus or Cancer, then they may be a little bit muted in that sense. Bob has Mercury in Gemini. Now, for some reason, I thought he had Mercury in Taurus, and I was really bummed out because I was like questioning the veracity of astrology because I was saying to myself, how can somebody who is that verbose as Bob Dylan, at least in his, what I would call his heyday in the 1960s, going into the 70s, who had songs that had multiple stanzas, like Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, how can somebody like that be Mercury and Taurus? So thankfully, when I finally generated the chart, I see that it's not that way at all. It's Gemini. And so Gemini can be very talkative. If you have Mercury in Gemini, of course the Sun in Gemini too, you're going to be very talkative. And if you're somebody who's a writer, you're going to tend to be very wordy. And that can be good or bad depending on the individual, whether they are good at what they do. Now, of course, Gemini is an air sign, so all air signs, and that includes Libra and Aquarius as well, tend to be very good at communicating. And Gemini, though, takes the cake because it is ruled by Mercury. So Mercury is definitely connected to the mind and communication. A person who's a Gemini, and by extension, these mutable personal planets and personal points, they can change their tune. They can change their opinions on things. Mercury can be your opinions. They can change, like their ideas. They can change their. With Venus and Gemini, they can be fickle romantically. And this can create a bit of confusion for other people because other people may be like, does this person really even have a core self? They just shift with the wind. What is this all about here? And really, I think with the Gemini and Sagittarius being ruled by Jupiter as Sagittarius ascendant, a person like this is really all about freedom. And I think that Bob Dylan, the movie, covers his rise in terms of prominence in the music field industry, and it culminates with him being at the Newport Folk Festival and going electric. I mean, playing songs with an electric guitar instead of acoustic guitar, and it's the stuff of legends. However, when I was watching it, it dawned on me, that was really a jackhole move of his, because he was at a festival that was supposed to be acoustic folk music. It wasn't a place for rock and roll, and he decided to do that. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Dylan in later years felt bad about it, regretted it, because he may have, reflected on it and said, you know what, that was really effed up of me, or selfish of me, to do something like that. But of course, it made him even more of a legend that he did something like that. And I think the reason he did it, I don't think he did it to be malicious. I think he didn't want to be put in a box. And, he was connected to the folk scene, specifically like Joan Baez and all of that political stuff. And the truth is that he didn't want to be defined that way. That was not really his particular bent. And I think one reason why is that if you have Mercury and Gemini, it's very hard to take a stance on anything, because you might see all sides of an issue, and you just don't feel like really passionate about one particular side. And the other thing that I think is that because his moon is in Taurus, I honestly believe that he has a rather conservative core self. I do think that I think it's possible to be progressive and conservative at the same time. And it can be that the person has issues, for instance, where they don't like, they're more conservative socially and more fiscally liberal, and vice versa. The moon indicates our need for safety, and what does that represent? And he happens to have it in the sign that rules the second house of earned income. So, and he also has Mars in this house. So, Mars in the second house can be somebody who's very driven to earn money. And I do believe that that's another thing that may have happened with Dylan, is that he saw the writing on the wall, and he saw that folk music was becoming passe, and he wanted to jump on the bandwagon of, music that was more hard hitting and less, airy fairy and all that kind of thing. So it's one of those things. It's almost like being opportunistic when it comes to making money and jumping on a trend and things like that. Not that he's like just kind of like really trendy that way, but I feel like he may be, and I think even just working in his 80s, yeah, he may love performing, but he may also love making money. I think his net worth is $500 million. So there you go. Not too shabby for a a guy like him. And I think it can also, when somebody has the moon in Taurus, they can be rather possessive in their emotional nature. And I think, because if somebody has the moon in Taurus, or you could even say the opposite sign of Taurus, Scorpio, and they have Venus in Gemini, you could see the dynamic where that person is very flirtatious, maybe even having affairs, extramarital affairs, or extra relationship affairs, and then being very possessive and expecting that other person to be totally faithful to them. So that can be pretty hypocritical for somebody who has this combination. I don't know too much about Dylan's private life to be able to verify that, but yeah, I could see something like that happening. His Mercury, discussed that. His Venus, like I said, it can be fickle, it can have two people at once. I mean, maybe having two relationships going at the same time. And even, I didn't realize this until after the fact, but apparently Dylan had a lot of input into the movie. I thought he was not anything, not connected to it whatsoever. And so apparently he was okay with depicting himself having another relationship while he was with somebody else. So that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that, they say Geminis love two of everything. So there you go. And Venus and Gemini, for people who are committed to their partner totally, it can simply be, that they're just flirtatious. And part of flirting involves talking. If you think about it, when you're at a party and you are attracted to someone, but maybe you already have a partner, and maybe your partner is at the party and you're not going to, do anything more than that, but you just kind of, just enjoy being very suggestive or whatever with this person that you're attracted to. And it's like verbal, like maybe it's kind of puns and things that can give people a love of being punny. And Mars is in Pisces. So when people have Mars in Pisces, if, that Mars is afflicted, they may have self-destructive tendencies, including addictive tendencies. They may be very, some form of addiction or escapism. But it can make them, just having Mars and Pisces as a whole, can make somebody very driven to create, to be creative. And I suppose also for some people, this can mean that the person is very drawn to spiritual pursuits. And looking at his aspects table and his Mars, one of the things I notice is he has a square between the Sun and Mars. This can be somebody who has a chip on their shoulder. They really feel like they're the underdog in life. Dylan was born in Minnesota. He grew up in a town called Hibbing, Minnesota. I don't think it had many people. I don't know exactly how many people it had, but it was, as far as I am concerned, it was in the middle of nowhere, but I could be wrong about that. I don't think it was one of the, he was born in Duluth, and I think Duluth is a much more well-known city, so it's probably more populous. And he was he was born Jewish. I don't know, he converted to Christianity at one point. I don't know what his current religious status is, but that kind of thing. I don't know about whether there were a lot of Jewish people in Minnesota. It doesn't seem like it, because there's a lot of I think there are a lot of people from Scandinavia, or Scandinavian descent. So I'm assuming they would be more like Christians. But yeah, so I mean, just being kind of like different than other people, perhaps, and I don't know like the financial status of his family, but it could be something along those lines too, of feeling like um, wanting to prove yourself on multiple fronts. And so that can make somebody competitive, but sometimes it might rub people the wrong way because the person's so ambitious that it makes other people feel uncomfortable sometimes. He also has a square between Venus and Mars, and this can be the male female dynamic is kind of, there's friction there. And the way I see it a lot is that, Dylan has a song on Blonde called Just Like a Woman. It's one of his most famous songs. And it's a very romantic song, but it's very much in alignment with the more, traditional way of looking at the male female relationship, of women being the weaker sex and, that kind of thing, the fragility. Of course, he was talking about a specific woman, but this idea of I think he was much more traditional in his attitudes towards the male female relationship, and of course he's a product of his era too, because this was before feminism. I'm talking about when he wrote a lot of his material in the 60s, but even just the way he was raised. So it's kind of adversarial, I would say. And I don't know if he's currently with someone, but he did, he has had some relationships that didn't last. And his marriage was was fodder for one of his albums called Blood on the Tracks, and it was very vitriolic. Idiot Wind, to be exact. But if a person has Venus square Mars in their natal chart, I think, I can't, speak to same-sex relationships, but I'm talking about the archetypal male-female dynamic. I do think that can be, there can be some friction there, some obstacles there, and I think it can even be that hard-headedness of the person where they really treat that opposite sex as almost like a different species. And that creates that sense of separation when that happens. He has a square between Mars and Uranus, and this can be, this is like a, square is a hard angle, and Uranus can be very, it's like having Mars in Aquarius, but with kind of a challenging bent or a negative bent to it. And it can be like the person who is like a rebel without a cause, so to speak. And that's, when I was talking about him going electric, there's that kind of theme, running theme in his life. You can see it if you watch some of the press conferences from his earlier days. And he has a very kind of defiant attitude to the press that is kind of funny because, the press, those interviews are actually ways to promote a person. So I think part of the reason why he may have been that way is because the press may have been, in some cases, dismissive. Although I don't, the Beatles experienced the same thing. I mean, if you look at some of the Beatles press conferences, there were questions that were a little bit, I would say, on the demeaning side, but they had such a quick wit that they were able to turn that around to their favor. So Dylan did the same thing, but he had a very acerbic wit, and so it, kind of had an edge to it. And I think this placement just means that the person may act recklessly at times. Now, it's really interesting because I hope they make a sequel to a complete unknown because, it stops before some, of his great achievements like Blonde on Blonde in 1966. And he also had a motorcycle accident, and I believe it was in 66. And as the movie ended, they showed him on a motorcycle, and I think that was kind of like um, a foreboding. So maybe it does mean that they're going to have a sequel. And that idea of, riding a motorcycle, to me, riding a motorcycle is rather risky behavior to begin with. So anybody who rides a motorcycle, to me, Mars square Uranus would reflect that. But especially if they're riding really fast. And I think people who have contact between Mars and Uranus may just love like roller coasters, anything where they can feel like that sense of speed, a need for speed. And speaking of Uranus, I think it's really important to note that Bob has conjunctions between his sun and his moon to Uranus. And why this is so interesting is because Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius, and it really speaks to being unconventional. And the conjunction, a conjunction can be neutral, it can be leaning more harmonious and more problematic, depending on what two planets are involved. And I think with the Sun Uranus combination, that the conjunction is going to be more harmonious because Uranus can be like genius. It can be the eccentric genius. When it's in conjunction with the Sun, the person's sense of self, but also how other people view them, can be very favorable, even if they are different. And people who are artistic are different. And sometimes that difference is not well received, and the person can feel that sting of lack of acceptance. Well, I have a square between the Sun and Uranus, and I've learned to laugh at it because it's just like par for the course. I've just always been that, kind of different, and it doesn't necessarily go over well. And I actually have a whole video if you're like me and you have a square, or maybe you have an opposition to Uranus, the Sun, to Uranus. I have a video on that. And I'm sure I have one on the conjunction where I just elaborate on that if you have that. But anyway, however he is different is not seen as a negative, okay? So that's very good for somebody to become popular because a person can be like a cult kind of an icon and stuff, and they may have like a limited appeal, and they're kind of like an acquired taste, but somebody like this can appeal to more of the masses. And he has a conjunction between the moon and Aquarius and Uranus, and that can be more on the emotional level, more of a detached emotional nature. So that can kind of counter any possessiveness per se. You can hear it in some of Dylan's songs, the detachment as he's talking about a lover and maybe that lover's betrayal and stuff like that. It's very kind of detached. It can be very sardonic, but it can be detached at the same time. He also has trines from the Sun and Moon to Neptune, which is very good for artistic creation and also for being a sensitive person in general and a compassionate person. So I want to focus on the 5th and 6th houses because the 5th house is love and creativity, And this can really showcase an artist. And he has a stellium here. He has 4 planets here. Okay, the 4 planets that he has, and it looks like they're all in Taurus, which is ruled by Venus, and that can be artistic. So he has the moon here. He has Jupiter and Saturn here. He has Uranus here. So some of these are outer planets. Jupiter isn't a personal planet, but it's not really. I don't know if it's officially considered an outer planet. It has a 12 or 13 month cycle through one sign. So it's not generational by any stretch of the imagination, but by the same token, it's not that fast of a transit. So basically, when someone has the moon in the 5th house, it's like they have an emotional need to create. And it is advised, if you have the moon in the 5th house, that you are creative on a regular basis, because it can be good for your emotional nature. It's a great emotional release, and you can channel your emotions through your art. I have this placement myself. It can make a person romantic, and I was going to say the word drama, because in astrology, the 5th house is ruled by Leo, which is a fire sign. And so there can be this kind of exaggeration of emotions and kind of a person's emotional needs. It's very childlike, not childish. It can be childlike, very like in touch with the inner child. And then he has Jupiter here, so this can make a person prolific, and certainly he has released many albums over the years. Can make them lucky in their artistic pursuits. He has Uranus here. This can be a person who is very like love is kind of a bohemian concept. In other words, it's kind of like free love, meaning, and that was certainly a 60s sentiment, is, love the one you're with, as the song goes. But just this idea of love being free, not being an obligation. Also, maybe falling in love with somebody who's an Aquarius. I don't know if he's ever had someone. That would actually be a good thing for him. His wife, Sarah, was a Scorpio. Or, I'm sure she's still alive. She is a Scorpio. And he's a Gemini, so I'm not surprised that union didn't last. But, his moon is in Taurus, and that's the opposite sign of Scorpio, so maybe that explains it. So he has Saturn here, and Saturn in the 5th house can be very good for an artist, because it can make them be disciplined artistically. You can be the most talented person on the planet artistically, but if you don't have the ability to discipline yourself, which, can involve multiple things, but like, for instance, creating on a regular basis, not in, sporadically here and there, but like just being very committed to your projects. Saturn can bring things to manifestation, so it's foundational and disciplined and taking things seriously. It's very important, if you are an artist, to take yourself seriously. And that's where the discipline comes in. Because if you think about it, um, an artist has to be very self motivated. It's not like they're going to go into the office and their boss is going to tell them to write a poem or a song and say, if you don't write a song, I'm going to fire you. So they have to be able to motivate themselves. And that means that you have to believe in yourself and take yourself seriously. And I think that Bob must feel that way. And I love to read, biographies and autobiographies of people in the arts because it just inspires me, because I do consider myself a creative person. And, you know, more times than not, especially if it's an autobiography where they're talking about their creative process, they're talking about, these disciplines that they have established. And so that's very important, and it doesn't get a lot of emphasis or attention. And I wanted to also mention the sixth house because he has um, the sun here and he has Venus. Now, the sixth house can be the work that you do. With Venus here, it can be that you are doing something artistic. And the sun here can mean somebody who is a workaholic. They want to be productive. Doesn't matter what, but they're just very disciplined because the sixth house in astrology is ruled by Virgo. So he's like an honorary Virgo having the sun here. And part of the sixth house is your daily routine. So when the sun is here, the person is very connected to the idea of routine. And that can make them able to, and also the sun is a creative force in and of itself. So in that house of work, it could indicate doing something creative. In his seventh house, he has um, Mercury and Chiron. Mercury in the seventh, I have this as well, is a real interest in other people's opinions on things. That does not mean that the person is necessarily swayed by other people's opinion. It doesn't have to mean that at all. It simply means that they're interested in other people's opinions. And I think also, because I know at least early on, no, I mean, he did it even in the 70s, writing songs about things that really happened. I think that can really lend itself to that sort of desire to communicate what other people have experienced as well, like kind of putting yourself in other people's shoes. And he had songs that were about, news events and, with the person's name in it and whatnot. And Chiron here can be possible pain as it connects with committed partnership. Now, sometimes I do feel that this is coming from the person themselves, like maybe they have trouble committing, and it creates a lot of pain for them because they feel like they can't make it happen. So this is for somebody who is a musician, a traveling musician, who really is married to their work. It can be very hard to have enough time for a relationship. And so that can cause pain because maybe they do want to be in a relationship. But maybe it's also on the flip side that maybe he experienced that with somebody else, that he could not um, sustain a relationship with somebody he really cared for. Um, his Chiron is in Cancer. This is the mother wound. So I don't know his dynamics with his parents. Like, it's kind of interesting because I don't know if I've read a full biography on Dylan, but I would be curious, like, after he became famous, did he was he in regular contact with his parents? He seems like the kind of person that wouldn't be, but who knows? Maybe he would be, because I know Jim Morrison, he never talked to his father again after a certain period of time when he became well known. But I think he did keep in contact with his siblings. Um, so I don't know if he had some kind of situation with his mother, and that could have gotten transferred to any woman that he was with. And these kinds of things, yeah, it is very important, because a man who, for some reason, maybe didn't have proper nurturing, or maybe in some cases it was smothering. I don't know if that could be the flip side of that. That could lead to perhaps somebody who finds it very hard to trust a woman, because they feel like they're going to get devoured by her, perhaps. Or somebody who never feels like they are loved enough, and that can happen as well. In his 8th house, he has Pluto. Pluto is one of the rulers of the 8th house in astrology, in the sign of Scorpio. But Pluto can indicate somebody who transforms themselves at a deep level, maybe multiple times. Maybe that's a theme of their life, is transformation. If you look at Dylan at different points in his life, when he first started his Woody Guthrie period, and then his, well, then he had his, I'm just talking about kind of superficial things, like he had his fisherman's cap, and he was like the bard, and then he was this, the mid-60s, and he had his fro growing, and he was like a hippie dandy. And then he was kind of going into this kind of Nashville skyline, late 60s, and kind of that, I forgot what they call like Southern fried rock, kind of like what the band is. I don't know, there's a genre, but very kind of that pure Americana sound. And then he went through these religious incarnations in the 70s, and yeah, so he really reinvented himself multiple times. In the 9th house, he has the North Node and also Neptune. Neptune in the 9th house can be a person who has visions that are of a religious nature. So just because, he might be that type of person, and it might be a mystical thing, and maybe he doesn't talk about this with the press or anything. Maybe that's something he likes to keep to himself. But he does have a conjunction with the North Node, and the North Node, it looks to me like the North Node is also in Virgo. So it's in the 9th house, so it's really funny, because the 9th house it is the God house, but it's also long distance travel and kind of Sagittarian, the Sagittarian sentiment, which is kind of being a global citizen. So certainly, because he's a world traveler for his work, and in conjunction with Neptune for his art, we can see that this has been his destiny. Not surprisingly, his midheaven is in Libra, which is ruled by Venus, making, the world a beautiful place. So his 10th house cusp, the house of career, is in Libra, and he has Venus, the ruler of Libra, in the 6th house of work. So there you go. With Sagittarius rising, he can be a very lucky person. It can speak to an expansive nature, and certainly to a lot of travel in his life, being that, kind of having that wanderlust, perhaps. That might be something that really um, is a theme in his life. So, yeah. Oh, one thing I did want to say one thing about Sagittarius rising, and I wanted to point out two other iconic figures in rock music who also have Sagittarius rising, namely Elvis and Elton John. Now, there could be others, and I just don't know about it, but yeah, I mean, those are big names. And Jupiter can be expansive even physically because the first house can be the body. And certainly Elton and Elvis both had weight issues, at least at some point in their lives when they were in front of the public. Or I should say just in general, because Elton was chubby when he was younger as well. But really, because Jupiter is the largest planet, people with Sagittarius rising, they may seem larger than life. They may have that aura. I actually think Dylan almost has like an anti-aura in the sense that he never was, I mean, there's like a reticence within him to really be that star. You don't think of Dylan, and his sun is in the sixth house, and that's very down to earth and very like work horse type of energy. And he has no planets in the 10th house. So he's not, and he has no planets in the first house. He's not somebody who's necessarily saying, look at me, look at me. Even when he's on stage, he almost kind of tends to shrink. You don't see him as like, taking up all this space. So anyway, I just want to point that out, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Thanks for listening if you've actually listened to this whole thing. Take care. Bye.